One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today's episode is part of the Follow the Money special summer series, where we'll be bringing you a selection of some of the best conversations from our popular webinar series. Andrew Quilty was one of only a few Western journalists who stayed in Kabul as it was overtaken by the Taliban in 2021. His new book, August in Kabul, tells the story of those final days as the Taliban took control of the country. This was recorded live on Wednesday, the 14th of September 2022, and things may have changed since recording. I'm delighted to introduce our guest today. Andrew Quilty is the recipient of 9 Walkley Awards, including the Gold Walkley for his work in Afghanistan, where he's been based since 2013. August in Kabul is his first book. It's the story of how America's longest war came to an abrupt and humiliating end after 20 long years, as on the 15th of August, the Taliban entered Kabul. August in Kabul is the first-hand account of those dramatic final days, told through the eyes of Afghans whose lives were turned upside down. Andrew was one of only a handful of Western journalists who stayed in Kabul as the city fell, and I can promise you it is a gripping and very intense but highly recommended read. I've hardly been able to put it down. Andrew Quilty, thank you so much for joining us today, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks for having me, Ebony.
I wanted to start at the beginning of the book in the prologue, where you kind of write about being on a plane back to Kabul on the 14th of August, kind of the day before the Taliban entered Kabul. It must have been very hard to pick a place to start with this book. Why did you start there? And tell us about that decision to fly back into Kabul on that day.
Why did I start there? I think, this was the first book I'd ever written, and I thought I didn't quite know where to begin. You know, I'd compiled over 100 interviews, and all the information I'd absorbed over more than 8 years living in Afghanistan, and I thought the easiest place to start was probably from my own perspective, which was although the book didn't follow in that way. The prologue led into the story as it was told by others who experienced it firsthand, and I just thought leading into it from as I experienced the days leading up to the return of the Taliban would probably be the easiest way to literally get some words on the page. So and those days that I write about, why did I decide to go back in? It was twofold. I on the one hand, I'd been working in Afghanistan as a photographer and a journalist for 8 years by that stage, and I knew that this was going to be by far the biggest news event in that time, probably the biggest news event, or certainly the biggest news event since the American-led invasion in 2001. And so it was obviously a place and a time and a place where a time that I needed to be in Kabul. But that said, I think the even greater was the fact that I had become part of the community there, and I had a lot of friends and colleagues. I had a couple of staff that worked in my house. I had housemates. I had a dog, and I just felt that I needed to be with them at that time, even though I wouldn't be able to do a whole lot to help any or many of them. I just felt as though I needed to be with them, and that not being with them would have been akin to I guess the same sort of abandonment that they were feeling on a much greater level.
Yeah. And I mean, what was that like flying in, as I'm sure other people were starting to fly out? It was obviously the day before, kind of so much urgency was applied to the situation, and things got very dire. But, you know, obviously there'd been a lot of clashes in the lead up to that day. You talked about kind of being on a plane that was kind of mostly empty heading back in. That must be quite something, kind of heading back into that situation, kind of knowing what's going to be waiting when you get there.
Yeah, it was pretty eerie. Although, I mean, it took me a couple of days to really come to terms with, or to make that final decision. I guess, although the factors that I described that contributed to my ultimately going back, you know, there was a lot of, I was afraid, I would say, you know, that we didn't really know how it was going to go down, or how long before it would. And there was still a very good chance that it was going to turn out into an all-out battle for the city, and that it would, you know, return to something similar to the civil war of the 1990s, where you had, in this case, it would have been the Taliban on the edge of Kabul, you know, shelling from the outside, and until the government forces ultimately collapsed. As it turned out, the transition couldn't have happened much more peacefully than it did, or with much less bloodshed than it did, at least in the final days. There'd obviously been a huge amount of fighting and loss in the months, not to mention the years prior. But in the final day, it was, I mean, it was mercifully bloodless. Yeah, it was. I mean, it was strange being on that plane. It wasn't the first time I'd been on a plane, you know, flying into a besieged city while everyone else was trying to get out. But I'd done that a couple of times in other cities in Afghanistan. But I think flying back into Kabul, I mean, firstly, the fact that it's a city of, you know, 5 to 6 million people. It was also my home city, and my home, and so it had a lot more. You know, whereas in the past, when I'd flown into besieged cities, I was, you know, nervous and, you know, excited, and on a more, you know, because of what I was going in as. I mean, I was going in as an observer, a journalist. In this case, I was yes going in as a journalist, but I was also going in as a resident who was, you know, kind of looking at coming home. So it felt very different, and my feelings for that reason were also very, very different.
Yeah. The book, essentially, you've talked about that you spoke to kind of hundreds of people. You've picked out a couple of key people and follow their kind of first person accounts of what happened. But before we kind of dive into those, I do wonder if you could take me through your experience of that day, the 15th, when the Taliban entered Kabul, and what that kind of felt like. And did the city, was everyone kind of well aware? Were people caught unaware by how fast it all happened? What was that like on the day for you personally?
Yeah, when we woke up on August 15, it wasn't certain at that point that what happened was going to happen. The night before, it was pretty clear that the Taliban were, you know, they were making their final approach to the outskirts of Kabul, and it looked as though they were going to be at the city gates within probably a day or two. But I mean, it wasn't even certain that morning. I had the night before, I'd been frantically, you know, although I'd just flown in probably 6 hours earlier, I was frantically trying to book tickets out of the country, just so I had them in my back pocket if I needed them. So I booked a couple of flights for later that week, and yeah, as I say, just so I had them. I didn't know whether I would need to use them, or whether the airport would even be open, whether the planes would be flying or not. But it was, you know, something to give me and my housemate who did the same, you know, some sense of an out, I guess. So the following morning, August 15, obviously to board those flights, we're in the middle of COVID, right? So we had to go and get PCR tests. So this is at about 11 a.m. on August 15, and me and one of my housemates went to this local health clinic, had our tests, walked outside, and we heard some faint gunfire off in the distance. And then all of a sudden we saw people rushing towards us down the street. We were walking along the side of the street, and everyone was rushing back in the opposite direction, and cars were turning around in the middle of the road and heading in the opposite direction. And people were saying, "The Taliban are here, the Taliban are here." And we sort of quickened our pace to get back home. And as it turned out, it wasn't the Taliban at all. The gunfire was from security guards out the front of banks in Kabul who were trying to control crowds that were lining up to withdraw their savings. And so, yeah, from that point on, that was the first domino to fall, and the Taliban were not even in the city. I mean, there had been reports of some small cells popping up here and there. That they had probably been existing cells that were, coming out from behind their cover. But there was certainly no. They didn't have any significant presence in the city. There was still the security forces were still at their posts and patrolling the city. But it was from that point that those security forces, I mean, they just got spooked. And I think this moment had been building up for so many months, and they'd been hearing the stories of checkpoints getting overrun out in the provinces, and soldiers being offered amnesty and surrendering to the Taliban. And I think this moment just broke any resolve that was left. And, one after the other, policemen and soldiers started peeling off their uniforms. A lot of them had arrived to work that morning with civilian clothes under their military uniforms, their police uniforms, and so they could just strip them off, to toss them aside, and blend into the community to a point anyway. And so my housemate, who was an American photographer, and we kind of nervously jumped on the back of my motorcycle, and we just went for a ride. We dressed in local clothes and slung our cameras over our shoulders, and we drove around to see what we could see. First of all, we headed for as close as we could get to the US embassy, which is obviously behind a lot of security, and so we couldn't get to the embassy itself, but we could get to a point a couple of hundred meters from it, which was in between it and the airport. And the first thing we noticed was the helicopters that were doing constant back and forth between the embassy and the airport. There was also some smoke rising from within the grounds of the embassy, and I believe that was an incinerator that was working overtime at that point, burning documents and hardware and all sorts of things. And and the day just kind of unraveled from that point on. My housemate and I were feeling a hostility that we'd never felt in Kabul before. People were looking at us in a much more hostile way, and they were sort of looking at us and the helicopters, and then yelling abuse at us, and basically lumping us in with what they considered the abandoning foreigners. And so it got to a point where we got threatened with a knife, and in the end we sort of jumped on the bike again, hightailed it out of there. We picked up a bunch of fruit and vegetables on the way home, thinking that, not knowing how the days to come were going to pan out, and we thought we might not be able to leave the house for a few days. And this goes to show how ill-prepared even we were, who'd been watching it. I mean, that's all we'd been doing for the previous weeks and months, and we hadn't even sort of stocked up on food. Such was the pace and the shock that came when it happened. And I remember at one point, we thought I'll pick up a watermelon. It'll last for ages and it'll be, good. It was it's the middle of summer. It was hot, and Victor, my housemate, had the watermelon on his lap, sitting behind me and holding a bag of fruit and vegetables, and the traffic by this point was not moving anywhere. Like, all the roads were blocked. Cars and bikes were up on the footpath and things. To get around a convoy of UN and armoured UN vehicles that were leaving a compound on the same street as us. All the occupants of the vehicles were fully kitted out in their Kevlar helmets and body armour, and had suitcases on their laps, and they were all looking pretty nervous. And to get around them, I jumped up on the gutter, and when the back tyre went up, Victor lost hold of the watermelon and it went flying, and it was like one of those moments in the movie. It was like, leave it, we've got to go. So this watermelon went bouncing down the street, and we hightailed it for home, and basically just kind of took shelter there to try and reassess what was going on. We jumped on Twitter, as you do these days, to get a sense of what's happening where, and we just kind of hunkered down for a little while, trying to work out what to do. We thought so that the UN convoy that had passed us made us realise that the UN on our street had abandoned their compound, and we thought, well, soon to follow will be their security guards, who block the entrance to our street that we just also happened to be on. And we thought, once the security guards go, our street's going to be it's going to be a free-for-all. People are going to come in and loot the UN compound, and we're sort of across the road down the street a little bit. We thought, we're going to be in trouble here. So we started calling around friends, asking whether they had room for us to come and just sort of hunker down. Houses that were not necessarily any more secure, but that they weren't as maybe vulnerable. They were on quieter streets where people would be less likely to go, looking for looting potential. So we did that for a couple of hours, and I was also making phone calls to veterinarians to get the drugs to euthanize my dog in the event that we needed to do that. He is a very loyal dog, but he's quite aggressive towards people he didn't know, and there was no way we were going to be able to take him with us anywhere, even to another house, let alone if we evacuated. And so I had to consider putting the dog down, and then after a few hours of this sort of and I went to pack a suitcase and just threw all my essentials in a suitcase, and I was kind of surprised to realize that after 8 years living in Afghanistan, my essentials added up to about a quarter of a suitcase. So I ended up just filling it out with carpets that I'd collected over the years. And then at one point, Victor and I came together in the house, and we just sort of realized that everything had gone quiet. Before, you could hear the sounds of the traffic and shouting and gunfire over the very high walls that surround our house from the street. Then all of a sudden, we realised it's gone deathly quiet. And so we poked our head outside the gate, looked up the street, and it was just empty. All the traffic had gone. Everyone had left the streets, and we thought, okay, this is the security vacuum point. This was kind of the point that I'd been most worried about, even more so than the Taliban entering the city, just because I thought, look, the Taliban are going to, that they have no reason to want disorder in the city once they come in. Like, once they do come in, they're going to want to secure the city, and they're certainly not going to be tolerating looting or violence or meted out by anyone other than themselves. And so I thought, okay, this is that lawless period where anyone who wants to take advantage of the vacuum is going to be doing so now. Fortunately, those guards at the end of our street were still there, and we went and spoke to them, and they said, we know what's happening. Everyone else is abandoning their posts. we're going to stay here until the Taliban arrive, and we'll just hand over our weapons and walk home, basically. So we were confident to an extent that our house would be relatively safe. And so we got back on the bike and drove out into the city, just again, trying to see what we could see. And first of all, it was quiet. It was like a weekend. There was very little traffic, but there were weird things were going on. You know, we passed one guy who was walking down the street with a scarf fully wrapped around his face, holding a pistol, probably just looking to rob people. We passed a guy who beside an overturned motorcycle who looked to be dead on the ground in a pool of blood. So it was there was this very strange, spooky, scary atmosphere. And then it was probably at about 4 o'clock or 4:30 that we came across, this was a fair way from home, towards the edge of the city. We came across a group of people huddling around something on the side of the road, and I sort of took a second look, and I could see two guys on a motorcycle. One of them was holding a AK-47 on the back. I was like, they're Talibs. And so without even thinking, I just pulled to the side of the road and I just said to Vic, follow me, and just acted confidently, walked over to them and said, can we take some photos of you guys? And they were fine. They were happy to be photographed, and we did. And then, everyone was standing around them taking selfies, and there was this real nervous energy. And then after a couple of minutes, they hightailed it off on their bike, and we gave chase. And then soon enough, we came to a traffic jam that was being caused by a handful of cars and an American-made Army armoured Humvee that was full inside and out of Taliban fighters with rocket-propelled grenade launchers and AK-47s and PK machine guns and Taliban flags. And we thought, okay, this is it. They're here. And again, people were lining the streets, kind of cheering, pretty nervous. I think they were probably doing this in a performative way to try and, make out as if, they had some affinity with the Taliban, whether they did or not, as a sort of survival tactic. And we hung around this convoy as it was edging its way through the crowd for about 10 minutes, pretty nervously. It was a big crowd and we were foreigners, and we thought, this could really turn ugly easily. But the convoy was edging along constantly enough that we probably didn't give anyone enough time to think about, like, okay, this is weird. There are some foreigners here. Shouldn't we be like setting up on them or something? And then eventually they got out of the traffic and sped off, and Victor and I just sort of wound our way through some back streets to get back to the motorcycle and headed for home again. It was getting dark by this stage, and we thought it's still pretty dicey. There certainly weren't a lot of Taliban on the streets at that point. They were the only ones we'd seen, and the Taliban actually hadn't given orders for their fighters to come into the city. It wasn't until early that night that we found out later the American commander at the time was in contact with the Taliban leadership in Doha, and they were arguing over who should take control of Kabul at this point to secure it. And in the end, the American general said, our orders are to secure the airport for our evacuation. If you want to take charge of security of Kabul, over to you. And at that point, the Taliban leadership ordered their forces who were surrounding Kabul to enter, and they made their way towards the palace, and others sort of filtered out throughout the city and took up posts throughout the city, and that was kind of that.
I want to come now to the some of the stories that you explore from the book. There's 3 stories in particular that really I wanted to get into. The first one is Suleiman at Antenna Post and the story of that. Then I wanted to ask you about Hamed, who was at the presidential palace, and Nadia, who I believe was a student. So 3 kind of very different perspectives, a soldier, public servant working in the presidential palace and a student there as three of many stories. Tell us a bit about Antenna Post and what happened there.
So Antenna Post was a small Afghan National Army outpost on the top of a hill that was punctuated by a mobile phone antenna, hence the name. And it was in the province of Maidan Wardak, which is just south of Kabul. And Captain Suleiman, who you mentioned, was posted there to command it and 3 other satellite outposts that were protecting a small road that ran into the district capital of one of the districts of Maidan Wardak. And by the time he arrived there in I think May last year, the Taliban were really starting to push their offensive in rural areas around the country. So, and including in Maidan Wardak. And so he was coming under quite a lot of pressure, and they were virtually surrounded. They were coming under attack every night. They couldn't resupply. They couldn't be resupplied with food or water or ammunition by road anymore.
Yeah, you talked about morale being like really awful because, they were deprived, essentially, couldn't get a lot of supplies.
Yeah, and they were at the top of this very isolated hill, and the only way for supplies to get in was by helicopter at night time, because the Taliban were literally surrounding the bottom of this hill and would fire on any helicopter they could see coming to bring supplies. And they got some supplies were dumped off target a couple of weeks after Suleiman arrived at the outpost and was begging for these supplies to be flown in, which kept them afloat and alive for a couple more weeks. But their ammunition was being depleted, and the attacks were getting more and more brazen. Taliban fighters, some of whom I spoke to, who had been part of the offensive against this outpost, said they would get as close as to the outside of the fortifications of this base. They'd be able to get up the side of the hill at night time and to lob grenades and even steal some of the floodlights that the Afghan National Army would place around the perimeter of the outpost to blunt the efficacy of their of Taliban night vision capacity. And the morale was just dropping and dropping. They had wounded soldiers who couldn't be evacuated. They were running low on food and water. In the end, they were having to drink. After they drank the water from the radiators of their vehicles, they started to drink their own urine. And all the while, the Taliban were, through intermediaries, they were offering amnesty if any of these soldiers surrendered. And so there was one surrender. One of these soldiers ran down the hill into the waiting arms of the Taliban, and there was a big propaganda victory for the Taliban. The Taliban then took his phone, and so they had all the phone numbers of the other people in the checkpoint, and they started calling them and sending them voice notes and offering them amnesty and money if they bought weapons and things. And so the morale was just plummeting. And maybe I'll leave it there so I don't ruin the surprise of the book of what happened from that point.
It was very just palpable, the sense of kind of, I guess, despair that was there, and help not coming after being requested. Yeah. It was quite a contrast. I felt like, quite a contrast to the story of the presidential palace and the civil servant that you talked to there, who was kind of quite close. Yeah, he seemed very close to what was happening, and still there was that lack of information, not knowing what was going to happen. Everyone just seemed to be operating in kind of a vacuum of information, even someone who was working in the palace. Can you tell us a little bit more about him? Yeah,
he'd worked in the media department of the palace for several years, and he told me how it was like he was living in two different worlds. In the palace, where he was constantly told, everything's fine. The army has everything under control, and we're going to, recoup and mount a defense of Kabul, and everything will be fine. The morale is good. Our security forces are aligned and strong. We have the support of the Americans. And then he'd go home at night, and everyone would be, afraid of what was being said, and watching the news and seeing the Taliban, taking over province after province. And he didn't really know who to believe, even though he worked very closely with the president even. But yeah, there was a lot of delusion within the palace, I think, and a misguided sense of the loyalty of the security forces. So on August 15, he turned up to work as usual. He was used to arriving at work on days where there was tension in the city. There might have been violent attacks or bombings that morning. Roads would be closed, but he knew he had to be at work as a press secretary. So it wasn't that unusual for him. But he, when he arrived at work, he noticed that, as I had, people were sort of flocking in the opposite direction to that which they should have been going for that time of day. And the day, as it did for me and everyone else, the day just sort of slowly or quickly unraveled. He also heard that gunfire that I alluded to earlier, and then kind of watched from within the palace as everything started to crumble, and the ministers of Interior and Defence started losing a grip on their forces, and the Presidential Protection Service, the Secret Service of the Afghan government, were kind of in disarray, and the National Security Advisor was sort of running from meeting to meeting, trying to work out what was going on with his American counterparts, and organising evacuation flights with spies from the United Arab Emirates, and it was very chaotic. And yeah, as you said, he had a very privileged perspective from within the palace as the republic was crumbling from its centre.
Yeah, and you talked about in the book, he was kind of watching this happen during the day and assessing what to do and if he needed to get out. But he was also quite conscious of the security of his staff. And I was really struck by the stories that you told of him getting rid of documents that might identify people and things like that. How widespread was that in the palace, and how important was that in the end? Ultimately, did the Taliban end up targeting people like him, and was he correct to be worried about those types of security concerns?
Yeah, no one really knew. That the Taliban had been very careful and strategic with their rhetoric over the months prior. As I said, they'd been offering amnesty to members of the security forces, so there was some reason to hope, at least, that civil servants like Ahmed Safi, that they would be okay. Certainly, if the security forces were going to be handled with leniency, I think there was reason to believe that public servants would be. But then again, no one that I spoke to really trusted the Taliban's word on the amnesties, and no one wanted to take the risk. So Ahmed Safi and certainly a lot of other government staff and obviously members of the security forces were destroying documents and went into their offices that morning to do so. And yeah, as you said, because a lot of the other palace staff had been told to stay home that morning, Ahmed Safi took it upon himself to destroy documents on their behalf. He had been in charge of organising presidential visits overseas and things. So he had lots of identification documents and passport photos and passport applications, visa applications and things. And so he took all those and burnt them and destroyed, deleted files from computers and things. In the end, the Taliban, I don't think there's been as big a sweep of retribution as some people expected, but it certainly has been going on. And I'm aware of some people who were initially granted amnesty and who have later been picked up and arrested. And I know of at least one member of the security forces who is being tortured, and others have fled the country, however they've been able to, and then others again, bureaucrats and public servants have been called on to go back to work with the Taliban to teach them how to run a government, to work as their secretaries and their IT support, and how do all these systems work? How does the passport printing machine work? All these things that Taliban have never had experience in, and they need a lot of these people. That said, they can't. I don't think many of them are being paid. So, and that's not a punitive measure. It's because they don't have any or very little capacity to raise revenue, and so few Taliban members are being paid either.
Mm. I want to come now to Nadia's story. Nadia Amini is a student, a young woman who, at the time all this is happening, has essentially just completed her exams. It was such a powerful story. I don't want to give too much away, but yeah, essentially worried about her family being at risk and her brother working with the police. Tell us a little bit more about Nadia's story and why you chose to put that in the book.
I really wanted to have the perspective of a young woman, because obviously young women were going to be among the most affected by a return of the Taliban. And Nadia was someone who had reaped a lot of the rewards of the past 20 years. She'd had a good education, she spoke several languages, and she hoped to go to university. But she'd grown up in a family that had been quite closely tied to the government. Her father had been a policeman during the communist era, the Soviet era. He had been arrested by the Taliban when they first came to power in the 90s, before escaping to Pakistan. And then when he had a family of his own, as well as Nadia, he had several other children, the eldest of whom also became a policeman. And around 2014, 2015, the pressure on him from the Taliban, who didn't control the village where they were from, but had enough influence to be able to threaten it quite seriously. They started threatening him and the family, and it got to the point that in 2015 the family once again had to leave for Pakistan. And from there, that elder brother and another one of his sisters went by overland to Iran, Turkey, and ended up in Germany as part of the huge wave of refugees that transpired that year from Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria primarily. And so with that safely in Europe, Nadia's father, who hated living as a refugee, there was no dignity, he had no status, he decided he'd move the family back. And instead of moving back to the village that was becoming increasingly threatened by the Taliban, they moved into Kabul, where they thought they'll be safer and they'll be able to hide amongst the masses. And even so, they would move house every year. They wouldn't be particularly social in their neighborhood. They would keep their business to themselves in order to try and ensure their security. And then, of course, as the Taliban started to round on Kabul, they became very nervous, because they thought, we've been able to hide until this point, but if the Taliban take control of Kabul, not only will we not be able to run, but we won't be able to hide either. And so Nadia's father and her and one of her other brothers who remained in Kabul sort of came up with this plan to appease the Taliban. And as unthinkable as it is, their plan was to hand Nadia over to a Taliban fighter into marriage, and with the assumption that would let their family off the Taliban's hook.
It's something very hard to contemplate for someone sitting here in Australia. But looking at that family's plight and the risks that they were under and what they were dealing with as a refugee family as well, it's just unthinkable for any family to have to face. But Nadia too seemed, listen to another interview that you did with Philip Adams, where you talked about she was very forgiving of her family and quite understanding in the end of how that all transpired. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, she could see it from her father's perspective. She knew he was under extraordinary pressure, and yeah, extraordinarily was able to forgive him for the choices he'd made, even though it was, potentially going to, ruin or end her life. She made it quite clear that she started carrying a razor blade around in her handbag, because she said, if my life is going to be ended by being married to a Taliban fighter, I'd prefer to end it myself. And so, yeah, I mean, given that, and she was fully aware of what marriage to a Taliban fighter meant, and the fact that she was able to forgive her father for that decision is, quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Obviously, all of these stories, and there's, millions of them, are very traumatic in different ways. I wanted to ask you, as a photojournalist or as an author in this case, talking to all these people and being with them at some of the worst times in their life, that must be very confronting for you to deal with. How do you deal with that tension, and what's your reflections kind of now that we're almost a year on from all those events?
Yeah, it was, I mean, I'd obviously witnessed a lot of people going through a lot of pain and suffering over the years in Afghanistan, but when that started happening in Kabul and happening to people that I knew, friends and colleagues, it took on a whole new level of significance, and has been a lot harder to come to terms with, I think. Previously, the war had, it had mostly been fought outside of Kabul, although there were obviously a lot of isolated and, sometimes quite common incidents of extreme violence in Kabul. It never really felt to me like a city that was at war. And I don't think it really felt like that for most people, although, there was always fear being out on the streets that you could get caught up in a bombing or something. It wasn't like you were crossing front lines on a daily basis or anything like that. And so, yeah, seeing it in my home city, occurring to people that I was close to, it was that made it a lot more confronting than anything I'd seen before. Even if it wasn't necessarily violence that was happening to these people, but it was their life being taken away from them, and the rug being pulled out. Having to give up their lives, give up their jobs, say goodbye to their families. Pull the door of their home close behind them, leave everything in it, just in the hope for many of these people that they could get inside the airport and then get on a plane abroad. Many of them, of course, weren't able to do that. And many ended up taking the much more dangerous route and have fled across into Iran, Turkey and beyond, and are living in extremely precarious circumstances, in this kind of purgatory where they have no sense of security or safety or home, and they're just basically surviving at this point.
Yeah, I've got a question here from the audience from Timothy McNaught that I think speaks to that a little bit. He asks, do you identify with the anger and frustration of some of our veterans who've tried in vain, in some cases for years, to get visas for their interpreters and field assistants and things like that? What are your reflections on that and the obligations that we still have as one of the countries that helped invade Afghanistan?
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, the Australian embassy was the first embassy by a matter of several months to pull out of Afghanistan. They pulled out without warning in, I think it was April 2021, and before any other embassy had really seriously contemplated it. So that gives you a sense that the fear that they had of the likelihood of a Taliban return. And so if they were that fearful, and if they thought that leaving was as necessary as that, then surely they had some kind of inkling that if they had enough inkling that they needed to leave, then why not those who they also had responsibility for? And why did it why did it come down to this 11th hour scramble to the gates of the airport, for which was not wasn't even possible for a number of people who were. I mean, I think there was something like 1,800 people were issued emergency humanitarian visas for Australia who at least a couple of months ago still remained in Afghanistan, and I'm aware of several of them myself. And yeah, it's look, the Taliban advance did. I mean, I was surprised by the speed of it. So I can't, and as was everyone. I suppose everyone thought that they might have had more time than they did in the end. But, if, as you say, people had been advocating on behalf of interpreters for years, and I know that the same to be true, certainly in the US and other countries, yeah, why did it have to be pushed up against that final closing gate to the extent that it was I guess obviously someone needs to be held to account for that.
Yeah. There's a couple of other questions along similar lines about, does Australia have a special responsibility to help those and increase our refugee intake from Afghanistan as well? We are a year on from all these events now. I mean, has the situation improved at all, or is there any sense that this will be resolved in a meaningful way, or is it just, it was poorly handled and continues to be so?
Look, the process has turned into just a slow, grinding, bureaucratic one at this point. And look, I received a response to a letter I wrote to the Minister for Immigration myself recently. Look, they are working through them, but there's, the labyrinth of Australian immigration bureaucracy is just incredible. I mean, when I started having to look at these forms, filling them out on behalf of Afghan friends, I was just at a loss. How an Afghan in Kabul, let alone in some other province, maybe with limited English or access to internet, would navigate this process, I just have no idea. And so look, I've got one friend who's basically going from city to city to try and stay out of the Taliban's crosshairs, all while this process is just working along at a snail's pace. And I don't know whether it can be hurried along. It's certainly not resolved. As I said, it's just slow at this point. And obviously, I think there's always an argument for increasing the refugee intake. I know that since the war in Ukraine has begun, the competition for those positions all around the world, particularly in Europe, has increased. And Ukrainians are often winning out in that sort of quota battle, which is pretty hard to see. I think the Australian involvement in Afghanistan and our military involvement surely imposes some kind of moral imperative that we need to not let be forgotten, and need to both acknowledge and to act upon.
We've talked a lot about kind of that day of the 15th when the Taliban entered, but of course there was a period of a couple of weeks after that and kind of before the Americans had pulled out entirely, where the situation just did seem to deteriorate, particularly at the airport, very rapidly. What are some of your reflections on that?
Oh gosh, I always I always find it frustrating trying to recount these stories, just because they, if I had 5 hours to tell you the story of one of those days, I'd still find it frustrating, because I can never seem to evoke the senses that were, just firing on those days. But I hated going near the airport. It was this horrible, dangerous, unpredictable place that, both as a photographer, I needed to get there to try and document this point in time that the past 8 years of my career had been leading up to, I guess. And also on several occasions, in an effort to try and help people get inside, friends and colleagues and others who, people back in Australia had asked me to help. And yeah, I mean, it was, yeah, I don't know where to begin. I mean, I had a Taliban holder, the knife from his AK-47 bayonet held to my throat. I got bundled up by a crowd outside a gate that was being controlled by a CIA-led militia that I'd done a lot of reporting on in the past, very critical reporting, and then got handed over to this militia. And I thought, I hope they don't recognise my name. But and then I got handed over to a CIA agent, and he was pretty forgiving, and he actually said, look, this gate's going to close within the next 24 hours. You should come inside. And I said, thanks all the same, but I live here, and do you mind if I go? And I had other times where, I was involved in a couple of minibus convoys that were carrying between 150 and 250 people, a number of them friends of mine or colleagues of mine or other journalists that I knew, into the airport. But they were always, 24-hour affairs where we would gather at a staging point, and we'd have people coordinating the efforts in several different countries from inside the airport, with Taliban contacts, with CIA contacts, with American military contacts, all in an effort to make these bus convoys run as smoothly as possible. One of them we managed to get inside the airport, and so me and a couple of colleagues, including that photographer friend I mentioned, Victor, and I ended up inside the airport, and then driving back out on these empty buses, and then trying the same thing again the next night or a couple of nights later, and failing on that occasion, being basically spending the entire night until midday the next day, going from checkpoint to checkpoint around the airport, being barred entry. And then another one where I was trying to help a guy who had an Australian visa to get in on foot. We got to the place we were told to get to, and we're told that the Australian Special Forces who were going to be there to collect us had left the gate, and all the Australians would be out the following day. So it was pretty harrowing times.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Well, I want to thank you again for your time today, and thanks everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. I mean, fascinating. It's a gripping read. It's August in Kabul. It's available now in all good bookshops. And thank you so much for sharing all that with us today, and for writing such an unput-downable book. Be careful about when you pick this up and start reading it, everyone, because it's very hard to put it down, but such an important story to tell, and one obviously that Australia has such responsibility for as well. So thank you for documenting it and sharing it with us, and thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Ebony. Thanks for everyone who joined.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye. This has been a special summer series of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is at australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a double T, and our podcast producer is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.